Okay, it's time to play some fighting games and answer some questions. I apologize for the terrible lack of content once again. There's just a lot of tech issues. Sorry if this episode ends up being a little shorter. I'm currently also starting to feel sick, so we'll do our best anyway. If you're wondering which side I'm on, Android 21 and Broly. That's me. Very similar team to them, but I would never play GT Goku. I'm not this kind of disgusting animal. So first question. So quick Overwatch question. How do you improve ult usage? I'm always so afraid of using my ult because I don't want to waste it, but when I do end up using it, I end up dying a couple of moments later. Yes, mostly because I play heroes like Pharah. On the other hand, I end up not using it to the point I will probably only ever get the chance to use it once during a round. I want to learn how to improve when I can use my ult during a fight, but I'm afraid of wasting important ults as a result. I mean, as far as learning goes, there's not really much you can do other than just, like, throw it out there, and if it doesn't work, well, fuck, you know. Yeah, you live and you learn. So, usually, it doesn't matter so much if the ult usage perfect, right? Like, this is one of those things that people usually outthink themselves on more than anything else, to be honest. Where this most commonly seen with people that play characters like Zarya and Reinhardt, because they have, of course, very big ultimates that, like, wipe a whole team if they use them correctly. So they end up holding them for a really long period of time trying to get this 6-man ultimate off. The thing is, if an ult kills 2 people, that's already a smashing success. You've literally killed a third of their team if you kill 2 people. So they don't need to be nearly as big as people think they do. And that's just the big ultimates like Earthshatter and Graviton, right? If you have an ultimate like Barrage, you know, theoretically this could also kill 6 people. But that's a really unlikely circumstance. So if you just use Barrage to get a quick pick on one guy, fucking whatever, the guy's dead. Like when you pop out on the soldier and you just fucking blitz the soldier, you're like, fuck this guy. The soldier's gonna be upset. Mental damage is of course a very big part of Overwatch, so as we know, the first team to tilt is the team that loses. And that guy's dead, and assuming all things are equal, you're immediately up 1 person in the fight, and that's all it usually takes, to be honest. Overwatch has this sort of snowballing effect in a fight where as soon as one team starts losing people, it's very easy to lose multiple people. This is why you'll hear people say, God, why is it when I die, my whole team dies? Well, because now your team's fighting 5v6. So it's like people usually outplay themselves in this regard, where they worry about it more than they need to. With a big team ult, if you kill 2 or 3 people, fantastic. And if you have like an okay ultimate, you just kill 1 guy with it quick, fantastic. If you kill 2 people with it, great. Again, that's a third of their team. That's a smashing success. And here's the thing as well, is it's like, suppose you just use your ult at the first opportunity you see, and you just keep doing this over and over again. Dude, if you used your ultimate like 5 times in a round, or when your opponent used like 2 ults per round, even if all of your ults were only okay, their ults will need to be exceptional every time to outweigh your cumulative contribution, assuming you didn't just whiff every single ultimate, I guess. Volume of ults used is a pretty big aspect of the game. So like, there's not much advice to give other than as soon as you see like a decent opportunity, just fucking go for it. And if it didn't work, whatever. You know, you learn something for the next time you use it. It's really just like people outplay themselves with it, and like don't be afraid of like easier said than done. But like, don't be afraid of using it, because like, the more anxious, I used to have this problem with with Zarya as well. I talked about this a few times before, where I don't really like playing Zarya because I feel like I'm very good at getting to the high energy, but I was very afraid. My ults were always quite bad. But that's because I'm outplaying myself more than anything else, right? Where I was sat waiting for these big 6-man ults, but like, if I get like 2 people, that's fine. There's 2 people dead, and then I'm just gonna go and drill straight through the remaining members of their team. I was just completely outplaying myself in this regard. And basically, I just forced myself to just use it at the first opportunity I saw, and I whiffed a fair few ultimates still, but eventually I was like, alright, you know, I've gotten a feel for the good times to do this now. And with ults like Barrage, with ults like Graviton Surge, like, if you can get, like, just 2 out compared to the other Zarya getting 1 out, chances are pretty good you won the game, to be honest, because Graviton's that powerful. So yeah, I guess it's not super helpful, really, because ultimately it's just like, just do it at the first opportunity you see and don't beat yourself up too bad if it goes badly. Which is easier said than done in both regards, but I genuinely believe that's the best advice I can give, is what I did, and I feel like it improved me in the end. It's just, you know, you're afraid of fucking things up. I understand. Yeah, hope that helped. Next up. I've heard Tracer can make good use of high ground, but whenever I try, it feels like I'm too far away and do little damage, and once I drop, it's usually not worth going back up. Doesn't feel at all like Soldier on high ground, especially with the buffs to Soldier. That's not in there, that's me. Any thoughts on how often I should be on high ground as Tracer in some best maps? So this is not something you're really doing as like a blanket tactic, right? This is something you're doing in a more specific circumstance. As opposed to somebody like Soldier, where you do just blanketly want to be on high ground, you know, because it's just an objectively better state for Soldier to be in. Tracer, it's something you're usually just doing it to harass tanks, and when there's not necessarily anything better for you to do. It's also a little map dependent because not all high ground is created equally. Tracer does need to be not like on top of the guy, but she needs to be kind of close. So you want the better high grounds for Tracer are the more shallow ones. What's a good example? King's Row is like a really good example where you can stand on like the platforms behind the first checkpoint, the balconies behind the first checkpoint, and have a great time kind of harassing them pretty much, because you're close enough to be able to hit basically everybody. But they do have to sort of commit if they really want to come get you. And then there's a lot of health kits nearby, regardless of the balcony you're using. There's a health kit nearby you can use, which is good for Tracer, because, you know, no self-healing, very fast. She does have self-healing, but, you know, recall isn't what I'd consider reliable self-healing. So, what's another good map? Guys like Dorado, I thought of, like first checkpoint, where if they're like on the street, you can be on the balcony behind them, shooting down at them, and again, you're close, but they have to like commit to actually come up and get you, because you're pretty safe up there. Third checkpoint as well, but it's going to be really hard for you to stand on that high ground uncontested. Let's see, what would be another good map? Hollywood, first checkpoint, the balconies. That's really good high ground because, again, like, close to them, but high up enough that they have to, like, come and commit to get you if they want. But there's so many routes around on Hollywood that you're probably just, like, be better off trying to get somebody. What's like a really good map? Numbani. Basically all of the balconies on Numbani. Again, close enough where where you can shoot at them, but they have to kind of commit to come up and get you. I guess the battlements on Eichenwald, second checkpoint, you know, the arch going up the track itself, standing up there and shooting down at people is pretty annoying. But like, so the reason you'd want to do this is basically it's really easy to harass tanks while you're doing this, right? Like, when you're playing Reinhardt and somebody starts shooting at you in the back, you have a very strong inclination to turn and block that, even if it isn't really worth it. Like, if Tracer's kind of away from you, shooting up, down at you, it's not really the end of the world, and you're better off ignoring it, probably. But that's not what your brain tells you, because monkey brain tells you, I'm getting shot, and I'm taking damage, and I don't want that to be happening. So they tend to turn and look at you anyway, which creates an opening for your team. This is something where the Reinhardt can kind of counter it by just not being bad, so, you know, but, like, it also has this, Watchpoint Gibraltar, second checkpoint, the balcony, or, like, all the catwalks in there, really fucking annoying. And, like, the other reason to do this is you've kind of got nothing better to do because the entire enemy team is, like, really close-knit together and they're helping each other, so it's really dangerous for you to go in and actually make an aggressive play. So you can do this for two reasons, where first off, you're filling space, you're just, like, harassing tanks and, like, harassing people that are close to you, thereby generating some ult charge while you're not really doing anything anyway. And it has this very subtle but noticeable effect on the enemy team where it will slowly pull on them a little bit, right? Because they don't want to just leave you up there. So what's going to happen is, like, somebody on their team is going to slowly trend towards you and maybe make at least a half-hearted attempt to try and get you. So it just creates this very gentle tug on the enemy team where they're all closely knit together, and you slowly tug at them a little bit to try and get them to move out of position and maybe create an opening, right? Not necessarily gonna convert into anything, but again, they're too close-knit for you to do anything super aggressive, so if nothing else, you're building ult charge and waiting to build up pulse bomb, so then you can blink into these people who are close-knit and hopefully kill them. And you just sort of pull on the seam, you know, you see the loose thread on the sweater, and you just, like, tug on it a little bit, and, you know, maybe it doesn't do anything, but then maybe you tug on that seam enough and the whole fucking sweater unravels before you, you know? So that's, like, the reason you'd want to do it, because ideally you are just, like, blinking up behind Anna and fucking drilling a hole straight through the side of her skull. But that's not always feasible to actually do, so it's more of a space-filling thing. But King's Row and Watchpoint Gibraltar, like, the two most clear examples I can think of for the first checkpoint and second checkpoint, respectively. And, like, King's Row, you've still got some high ground even on the second and third checkpoints you maybe can use as Tracer with a little bit of setup, but, you know. So, there you go. That's what I got for you on that one. Next up, do you have any advice for an Orisa player who is really struggling to hold space, especially on defense? This would be for high plat, low diamond, and then some context, blah, 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 blah. Basically, defense is hard to play as Orisa. So, you are sort of dependent on your teammates to help you with this one a little bit as Orisa, because Orisa doesn't have the same kind of broad presence that Reinhardt does. Because the reason Reinhardt is so effective at, like, holding a line is if you close on the boy, he's still big, he can still use his shield in combat, and he swings around and he does 75 damage to everybody next to him, which is, of course, scary, you know. This is why when tanks complain about having gold damage, that's absurd, because tanks, of course, have to do high damage, because if they didn't do a lot of damage, you would just be able to completely ignore the tank, which would not exactly be productive for them making space. But Orisa doesn't have that same kind of presence because you're only hitting the one guy, and you're a little soft when people actually get to you. So you are a little dependent on your teammates helping you on this one. This is why Orisa Roadhog is one of the generally held examples of very good tank synergy, because Orisa does the line holding, but Roadhog provides this very scary presence next to Orisa that kind of slows their advance, right? Because Roadhog's, of course, very good at doing shield damage, and then his hook is scary as well, thereby slowing them enough for Orisa to kind of work them over a little bit at range, because Orisa does want a little bit of extra time to work them over at range, given, you know, that's kind of her thing, you know, the longest range tank, pretty much. I guess Zarya is technically longer range if you were really good at landing those high-energy grenades, but you understand the point. So you are a little dependent on your teammates for this, but what helps Orisa is, but with holding space, particularly on defense, is basically how you use your cooldowns, because Orisa's cooldowns are all quite strong. Her shield, of course, has been nerfed, which is very upsetting, but she's still, like, it's still okay, you know, it's not unusably bad, but it is very sad at the same time. It's certainly not what it used to be. But Fortify and Halt are very strong cooldowns also. So what a lot of Orisa players do that contributes to them having trouble holding lines is they don't use Fortify very well. Because Fortify actually gives you a startling amount of extra durability in a fight, but Orisa players tend to panic use this Fortify because they start taking some damage. But like, you really want it for like when the fight gets to you, which it basically inevitably will. You would be playing a very blessed game if the enemy stayed at long range the entire time while you were playing Orisa. You're going to have to kind of fight them up close eventually, and Fortify is really good for that. So, like, a lot of Orisa players do... This is, like, the thing that, like, Toes players do, where their shield will break and they will walk forward and use Fortify to body block some damage instead. And there are times when you would want to do this, but the risk with doing so is that if the enemy makes a really aggressive play now while Fortify is on cooldown, you are at a significant disadvantage in the upcoming fight. So while you do want to use Fortify to body block occasionally, you need to be really careful when you do so, because Fortify is most of your sustain when you actually get into the fight, and it gives you a surprising amount of sustain. It's, if the enemy gets to you and you don't have Fortify, you fold like paper, because Orisa doesn't have that much health, and her head hitbox is absurdly large. To almost a degree where it's harder to not headshot Orisa. But Fortify reducing your damage so drastically gives Orisa a surprising amount of staying power in the fight, to the degree where you'll probably be able to get off another halt or shield, or maybe both, in the fight, which can be all of the difference. So you want to, like, be careful how you use Fortify. You also need to be careful how you use your shield, because of course it's quite fragile now. So you can be in a position where you place it down while the enemy have like a lot of burst ready to go, and it ends up just immediately breaking. She of course can't move it freely, so you could end up putting it somewhere kind of far up, but the enemy team, this is a fairly nebulous explanation, I admit, but if the enemy team has more tempo than you when you put your shield down, there's the risk that they're just going to immediately blaze right past your shield, and then you don't have it for the actual fight, and then that's, of course, very scary. So, you kind of need to be able to read the fight a little bit so that you don't put the shield down and then basically see it immediately break in front of you because you happen to put it down, like, right as 3 different sources of burst damage were coming. You know, you put it down, like, right as Reinhardt's using Fire Strike, and then the micro missiles come in, and it's like, it just folds immediately, basically, out of that alone. Not out of those 2 things alone, but, you know, plus any other damage coming in, it's going to be pretty beefy. So, and then if they have more tempo than you, then there's the risk they'll just run straight past it. So you kind of need to read the fight a little bit to not end up just kind of wasting your shield. Because it, you know, only 600 health. It tends to fold pretty quickly. Even in the best of situations, you know, it's still going to end up folding really quickly, which is kind of the scary thing about it. So, on top of just aim better, also being helpful for Orisa. You know, if you're really good at, like, landing the damage as they're coming in, it makes it a lot scarier for them to actually come in. And then Halt is a really good utility, because slowing the enemy team down even just slightly is a pretty big utility. Like, just like halting a Reaper when he's on somebody, or halting Genji while he's using Dragon Blade, is usually enough to, like, actually save somebody's life, assuming other disastrous things aren't happening at the same time, because even just, like, a slight slow can be enough to really fuck the enemy's momentum. So, like, it's, holding ground with Orisa is mostly down to ability usage. It's typically an issue with Fortify, I find, because Orisa really does fold very quickly without Fortify up. More so than the other two, because the shield and the halt, you know, they're fairly obvious how to use them. There's some nuance to it, of course, like halt trying to pull them up off the ground, so they have to fall again before they actually get to move, elongating the CC a little bit. But for the most part, they're pretty straightforward to use. Fortify, people have a tendency to kind of use randomly, either really early before the fight starts, just to kind of like shave off poke damage, which is not really the end of the world, because like it's poke damage, so you're not fighting yet, so you could probably just get healed up anyway. Or they'll use it like while they're still being covered by their shield, which you don't really want to do. Like, really, you want to use Fortify when your shield is down, or like your shield is up, but they're just pushing on you so aggressively it's over anyway. You don't really want to use Fortify and shield at the same time, because basically you're doubling up on damage reduction at that point, which tends to give some diminishing results as opposed to using both of them independently of each other. But you know, it's that's also case dependent. There will definitely be times where you need to use Fortify when your shield is up anyway, but you try and avoid it if you can. So that's what I got for you mostly, is just like a cooldown usage stuff is probably the issue with Orisa, because she is pretty dependent on her cooldowns. All tanks are. But Orisa, if you use them badly, you can end up conceding a lot of space really quickly. And some of it will definitely be team. Not just your team as well, but the team you're playing against. Like, if the enemy team has, like, a lot of barrier break, it's going to be really hard for you to actually hold much ground as Orisa, because your shield is going to cave so quickly. It's going to give you, like, really limited resources to work with. So you might end up being better switching to Reinhardt if you're playing against a really, like, shield damage heavy team. Just because of, like, even if you put your shield down completely optimally and it breaks within, like, 2 seconds of putting it down, you know, it's already not great that you can't move it around freely, so if it's just folding like paper constantly, you'd probably be better off just playing Reinhardt. And, like, if your team is, like, kinda close range, Orisa's also going to struggle as well, because Orisa really benefits from having more long-range heroes on her team. Something else that's actually pretty big with Orisa is just positioning slightly differently on some maps, as you would versus Reinhardt, which is basically to say stand a few feet back, comparatively. Or leverage high ground if you can. Orisa's a lot better at leveraging high ground than Reinhardt. So, like, a really obvious example is Hollywood's first checkpoint, where Reinhardt players are basically going to stand right at the edge of the point, pretty much, or approaching the archway, whereas Orisa, you're usually better off just standing on the balcony over the cafe, really, because you get to defend the people up on the high ground with the shield. It makes it way harder to deal with high ground defenders if they're stood behind Orisa's shield. And you can just, like, stand up there and, like, shoot down at them as much as you can. And, like, you know, eventually you're going to have to jump down, sure. But if you're hanging out on high ground, you're probably not going to have to use Fortify at all, because you're on high ground behind a barrier. And that means when you do have to jump down, you'll have Fortify ready to go, which gives Orisa a lot of staying power, as previously stated. So try to leverage high ground if you can on maps like Hollywood, Or, what's another good map? Hollywood's the obvious example for me. Numbani. A lot of people on the first checkpoint, when they're defending, they're going to stand on the balcony, you know, up front near where the staircase is that the enemy team always comes up from. If you're playing Orisa, you're probably better off, assuming you have any long-range boys. You might have no long-range boys, in which case standing on the high ground becomes less good. But you'll be better off on Numbani standing on the other balcony further back, because again, Numbani's high ground is really obnoxious anyway. Like, it's really tedious to get high ground defenders off on Numbani. So if you're stood on that balcony instead with a soldier and an Ana, that's really fucking annoying. Like, you usually want to get divers and flankers up there to try and get them off the high ground. But like, if you're Orisa and you're sat up there with them, it becomes so much harder to dislodge high ground defenders. And again, you know, you're going to have to jump down eventually. It's just the way of things. But try and leverage high ground as much as you can, pretty much. And maybe just stand like a few feet further back than you would on Reinhardt. Because again, you want to be, you want some more time to work them over a little bit. Like Junkertown, defending the first checkpoint. People usually like to stand up at the very first corner on that map under the bridge. I don't like doing that anyway, but like if you're playing Orisa, you're really not going to want to do that. You'll be better off standing back at the archway between the two doorways instead, because again, you've got more time to work them over before they get to you, pretty much. So yeah, that's pretty much what I got for you on the Orisa. And you will be like a little teamwork dependent a bit. You always kind of are as a tank, but like Orisa, it's really hard if the enemy team can just kind of like blast straight up to you. So, you know, but you can say that about every tank at the same time, so you know. So next up, and this is going to be the last question for this week, is, as Ana, I never know when to move up and play with my team and when I need to sit back and heal from a distance, or I make the transition too late. What are some general scenarios that will help me understand when to switch my playstyle other than they do/don't have dive? So, this is just a blanket thing. If you're ever not sure where you should be standing next to your team is basically going to be a safe hedge, where it will, if not be the best thing you could be doing, it will probably still be a good choice to make at the very least. So that's just like a safe hedge if you're ever not sure what the best position to stand in would be. Hedging closer to your team is just kind of usually safe. If not, like, the best choice, it'll be okay. So, I find what usually is the problem with Ana in regards to this kind of situation is that people don't follow aggression quickly enough, because, you know, usually sitting back and healing from a distance is more obvious when you need to do it. Because, like, they're pushing in right now, so I probably don't want to be as close to the front line as I currently am. You know, it tends to be a little bit more obvious. It tends to be more of an issue where your teammates will slide around a corner and you can't see them anymore, and now you have to run to catch up to them. And, basically, like, a decent way to figure out, because basically you're going to need to know, like, is my team likely to rush around this corner in the near future, right? So, one way to figure this out is, like, what your team's ults are like compared to the enemy, or, like, whether you have aggressive ultimates or defensive ultimates is probably the best way to say this. So imagine, what's a good point for this? Imagine we're, like, Numbani's second checkpoint, right? And we're pushed back a bit, we're like near the bus, right? Our team is standing up and they're fighting at the bus, pretty much, around the corner. But we're stood like around the corner, kind of near the staircase with the small health kit in it, back past the bus. So what can happen here is our team ends up being in a good position, so they rush around the bus to follow up on this engagement, and now, oh fuck, we were in the back next to the doorway though, so now we have to rush to catch up to them. So if we have a team that's going Rein Zarya, right, if they have their ultimates ready, then this situation is going to go something like, Rein's going to see an opportunity around this around the bus. And so he earth shatters and the whole team rushes around the corner to follow up on this, and oh fuck, we have to run to keep up with them. If you push tab and you see Ryan and Zarya have their ultimates ready, then this is a solid possibility that this is going to happen, where they're going to do this around the they're going to end up initiating around the corner, and I'm going to have to run to keep up with them. So if you see that you have your aggressive ults ready, then you'll want to go and stand a little closer to them. Now, of course, you probably still don't want to be right next to them because that's scary, but you'll want to, like, split the difference a little bit more, where you're closer to the bus than the staircase, so that you can follow up if the situation goes aggressive. But you're also far enough away from the corner that if things go badly, you still got time to run back and retreat to the safer position. On the flip side, if they're coming up on the fight, neither of them have their ultimates ready, then they're unlikely to engage in this play where they run around the bus, because you're not likely to have this super strong engage anymore. It's more likely to be a slow engage, or the enemy team is going to engage on you. And if it's a slow engage, you've got time to follow up on them because you'll be able to read the way the fight is going easier. And if they engage on you, they're not going around the bus anyway. So you can, like, estimate roughly based on what your team's ults are doing like that, depending on the ultimates that you have. Because instead, imagine that your tanks are Orisa Roadhog. These are two not particularly aggressive ultimates. Orisa wants to put the bongo somewhere safe so it doesn't break and she can get as much duration out of it as possible, which usually doesn't mean running into the enemy team. And Roadhog, Whole Hog has aggressive applications, but is typically used in a defensive fashion as opposed to an offensive fashion. So if your tanks are like Orisa Roadhog, you kind of don't have to worry about this so much likely, because they don't have the kind of ultimates that are gonna give you this really fast engage that you need to follow up on. But if your tanks are like Hammond Winston, then they don't necessarily have aggressive ultimates, though they have aggressive applications, but they're just aggressive heroes instead. So then you're going to need to be thinking about this more or less constantly, because even though they don't have aggressive ultimates, they still might rush around this bus at a moment's notice, so I'm going to need to be ready to follow up on that when I wouldn't necessarily need to be ready before. So you can kind of read it like this, and it does not necessarily just your tanks, because you might have a DPS that has a really aggressive ultimate instead. Like, if you have a Sombra, then she is almost certainly going to Emp around the corner on this bus. So, or to counter-engage, I guess. But again, you know, Emp, it's a pretty strong engage. The enemy team is going to immediately start backing up, and your team's going to immediately start moving forward. So you might see that they have their aggressive ult ready, so again, you want to, like, split the difference a little bit so you're ready to follow up on this if you have to. So that's just kind of like a general thing you can do, like a general kind of way to know if you might need to rush to keep up with your team, depending on the ult situation, both what you have and what ults are ready to go. And again, if you're not sure, because sometimes these situations get really complicated, you know, nobody knows what to do 100% of the time, because sometimes you end up in really weird situations, or you're still trying to figure these things out, so you're still not sure what to do. Again, if you're not sure, being closer to your team is just a safe hedge. It'll probably be okay, if not the best decision you could make. It'll still be okay, at least. So, what else would be like a good example map? Because basically it's like going to be the sharp corners that get you on these things more than anything else. Because, like, if your team engages a fight on King's Row, you would need to be really fucking far back to not be able to follow up on these things, because the sight lines on King's Row are so long. So you wouldn't run into so much of a problem with this on maps like that. It's going to be more sharp corners that get you. Like Gibraltar, first checkpoint, you might be pushed back to the hangar doors. So now your team could be fighting up near the ditch, but yours stood like on the high ground further back. So, but if they engage a fight and they run into the ditch, you're going to need to run to keep up with them. So you're going to want to keep in mind like the ult situation and the team comp situation. And then you can take the enemy team into account for this as well, of course, because if they have really passive ultimates, then your team is more likely to commit to a hard engage, which means you'll need to run to keep up with it, versus the soft engage. But the enemy team might basically be all in hard engage because they've got the dive heroes, so you need to bear that in mind instead. Or they might be doing Rein Zarya, in which case you take their tank's likely ult situation into account, whether or not they're likely to go for the hard engage. Because if they hard engage on you, you're going to want to back up, and you're going to want to be further back as opposed to closer. As opposed to if you have the hard engage. So that's kind of what you're really thinking about on if you're going to need to keep up to the enemy team. Like, is our team going to hard engage or soft engage? Is their team going to hard engage? Is their team going to soft engage? And also the big thing for that, really. Because most let's be real, like almost all hard engages in this game are ult-based, right? It's Earthshatter happened, Emp happened, Graviton happened. This kind of thing is like how hard engages happen. Soft engages are like Orisa put down a bongo and her team started marching forward. Right? So that's the main thing to think about, pretty much. Whether or not they have dive is also a big thing to consider, but you set aside from that, so like, you know, the ult situation is the other really big thing to take into account, because if you think their Zarya has Graviton ready, you're going to want to be further back from your team, because you're not going to want to be in that Graviton. If they have Earthshatter ready, you're going to want to be further back or playing near a corner so that you can duck out of the way if you have to. Stuff like that. So that's going to be that's the main thing to think about, really. Hard engage versus soft engage for your team. Other things can play into this, just with the general tempo of a fight, because something might happen where someone on the enemy team ends up going way out of position and you're pretty sure they're going to die. A pick is one of those things that's going to prompt an engagement from one side or the other. So if you can kind of read that somebody on the enemy team is out of position and therefore likely to die in the near future, you might want to start moving to keep up, because if that guy does get picked off, your team's going to want to try and capitalize on that momentum and push up. So you might need to start running to catch up a little earlier if you can kind of read that sort of thing happening. But that's the kind of thing that you worry about more once you're used to this kind of situations, right? Because you want to, like, focus on one thing at a time, really, when you're trying to improve. So I would say the big thing to think, like, before you start worrying about these more, like, specific tempo moments that might happen, just worry about their ults and hard engage versus soft engage first, and once you got that down, then you can start looking for these more subtle things that kind of dictate how a fight is going to go, like whether or not it looks like somebody's about to get picked off on their team or your team. Because that's the kind of thing that can have, like, it's not necessarily immediately obvious when someone is dead, but sometimes there's a situation where you can read, like, 5 seconds ahead of time, like, that guy's probably gonna die in the near future. But, again, worry about, like, the ults first, pretty much. And that's pretty much, like, the best advice I got for you on that one. So, hopefully that helped. Oh, it was only 4 questions, but we managed to stretch it out for nearly 40 minutes. Good job, me. They were actually all really good questions, to be honest. I'm also just, like, a very rambly person, but, it's actually all, like, very good questions, that, like, we haven't really talked about much, to be honest. You know, one of the things I feel like with these videos is that I usually end up repeating things a lot, week to week, but, haven't really talked about most of that before. Like, Tracer using high ground is something I don't think I've ever actually talked about before at all. I'm about to die, because he is actually, assuming he doesn't drop it right here, this is going to kill me. He didn't drop it. Yamcha has got some pretty fucking wild combos that he can do right at the end. That's why he's a really good anchor. Fantastic assist, and he's got some pretty cheap stuff you can do to try and close out a fight. As well as being one of the few characters in the game that can get 2 supers off in one combo unassisted. Anyway. So, there you go. So thank you very much for watching if you did. If you have any questions, feel free to ask. I'm more than happy to answer you. If you have a question you would like to see answered on the show, Please use your preferred method of communication, be that email, comment, Discord, ESP, smoke signal, seismic tremors, whichever. I start streaming on Twitch Thursday, Saturday, Sunday, 8 p.m. EST to 11 EST. There's a link to the channel in the description. If you managed to make it all the way through the video and still enjoyed it, please like this video and subscribe for more content of middling quality in the future, and hope you found the video helpful.